But I like the spirit of it. Okay.
I think it just turned off.
Okay. Well, can you press play? Oh, BRB. We'll get started shortly. Thank you guys for coming, for sticking it out in the brutal March weather. I tell you, Chicagoans get weak come March. There's a threat of snow. Happens every year.
Are you doing anything for spring break?
It's just so far away. Was your spring break and my spring break the same?
It's the week before Easter. It takes me this every time I visit something's more than once. He's like, have I told you the penguin joke yet? So a guy is driving down the highway and he sees a penguin like trying to hitch a ride, so he slows down and he picks the penguin up and starts to take him into the city, and a police officer pulls him over and says, where'd you get that penguin? And the guy's like, I just picked him up. And the police officer's like, what are you doing? Take that penguin to the zoo. And the guy's like, okay. And the next day, the police officer's in the same place, and he sees the same guy driving along, and he sees the penguin in the passenger seat. Do you know this joke? He pulls him over, and he's like, sir, I told you to take that penguin.
All right. Are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thanks, guys. Woo! This volume is louder than it needs to be. Yeah, you guys need to be extra loud if you're here in person today. I've been lamenting to everyone. It is March, and there is the smell of snow in the air, so all the Chicagoans have wussed out except the hardcore people who are here right now. And if you're tuning in online, thank you for tuning in. Thank you guys for being vaccinated. It's March. It's Women's Month. That's exciting for us. we accidentally have all female speakers during the month of March. So I did that on purpose, if anybody asks. We're a women-run organization, so March is fun for us, and every day is fun for us. Any day is fun that you get to work with your friends. How many of you is this your first ever time being here? Woo! Okay, all right, we have some first-timers. Welcome. My name is Patty Swanson. I started Chicago for Chicagoans in 2016. It has been a wild, pandemic-filled few years since then, but we're really excited. This year we're bringing back walking tours. We haven't gotten to do that in a couple years, so we're doing that this summer. We're almost to the end of our winter lecture series. I've been joking that the theme this year is all of the stuff that people were researching while bored at home for a couple of years. I invited all of our speakers to propose a topic on anything they wanted, and to really just let loose with new history or stuff they were excited about. And I'm really excited with the topics that we have this year. So we've got a lot of great ones coming up. Next week we're talking about women who developed Chicago. After that we're talking about Catherine Deering McCormick. And then we've got a few more left as we trickle into April, so make sure you guys sign up, keep coming. We do this every Thursday except on the 24th of March. We will not be here, so you can come here, but we won't be here. We're broadcasting live from room 13, a bar in Lakeview. You can come here sometimes if you like, grab a card on your way out. What else? Oh, we are a pay what you can organization. We have been since day one. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're entirely supported by your generous donations. So we do appreciate if you enjoy the lecture tonight, if you find yourself learning something new, and you have a little cash to spare, please consider throwing some money our way. We are almost, again, entirely supported by your donations, probably 95% that, and then 5% random donations from people's jobs. So we really appreciate you guys being here and contributing. And if you're not in a good place to donate, no fear. We also accept Google reviews, Yelp reviews, Facebook reviews as a very legitimate form of payment. So without further ado, I'm incredibly excited to introduce our speaker tonight, Emily O'Keefe Davenport, who is yes, all the claps. All the claps. Emily actually went through our Tour Guide 101 training last summer. We're going to be doing that again this year, so you too can come up here, sit, and tell people about things that you know, or walk around with them if you like to. You can also learn to give a tour. But it's really exciting. We've had several of our people that went through that program speak this lecture series, and they're all absolutely fantastic, Emily included. And the topic she's speaking about tonight is probably one of the coolest and most unknown little bits of Chicago history. So without further ado, give it up for Emily.
All right. Thank you all for coming. So I'll be talking today about Margaret Anderson, and she
You can do whatever you like.
Yeah, I'm sure. So Margaret Anderson was truly a one-of-a-kind person. She became known for cultivating a literary circle in Chicago. She was very idealistic, very charming, very glamorous. She kind of drew people to her, and she was very devoted to what you might call art with a capital A. She was very into the arts, very into experimental art and literature. And she's best known for being the editor and publisher of a magazine called The Little Review, which came out initially in Chicago between the years of 1914 and 1929. This was a small magazine. It was part of what's known as the Little Magazines movement or trend that was associated with modernist literature in the 1910s and 1920s. These were magazines that never had a really large circulation, but they were very important. They introduced people to a lot of new writers. The Little Review at its peak had a circulation of only about 3,000. And just as one contrast, The Ladies' Home Journal, one of the larger magazines of that period, had a subscriber base of about 2 million in the 20s. So yeah, very small, but they published Ernest Hemingway near the start of his career. They published T.S. Eliot and James Joyce, Carl Sandburg, W.B. Yeats, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, just all of these really important writers and thinkers. They also published a lot of art. They also explored a lot of daring political and social ideas, including things like ideas about birth control and ideas about gay rights, which was very rare at the time in the 1910s. Essays about anarchism, anti-war stuff. And I mean, some of these issues, you know, in the recent past might have been risky to talk about, but especially at the time when, in some cases, people would face legal consequences for actually publishing about these topics. And perhaps inevitably, the Little Review did get into trouble with the government and did face censorship. Yeah. Since laws controlled pretty strictly what could be sent through the mail at that time. And most infamously, when the Little Review serialized James Joyce's Ulysses, the Postal Service confiscated and destroyed a few issues, and eventually Anderson and her co-publisher, Jane Heap, went on trial for obscenity and lost. So yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit. You can see a photo of Anderson on the handout. You can see how, you know, she's very striking, and you can see a photo of her with some of the contributors to the Little Review, including people like Ezra Pound, Man Ray, Mina Loy, if anyone's familiar with her, the poet Mina Loy. And just to kind of introduce what people's impression of Anderson was, here's a quote from Ben Hecht, the screenwriter who also contributed to the Little Review. He said, during the years I knew her, she wore the same suit, a tailored affair in robin's egg blue. Her chic seemed always surprising to me, for a wind was constantly blowing through her head. It was surprising to see a coiffure so neat on a noggin so stormy. Her name was Margaret Anderson, no kin of Sherwood, and she was the editor of the Little Review, or as it seemed to me in that time, keeper of the literary heavens. Not bad for a girl from Indiana. She was born in Indianapolis in 1886, and she described just feeling very stifled from her bourgeois family, who always wanted to move. They were very obsessed with furniture, she said, and she would do things like write letters about injustices in her home and put them on her father's desk. So she finally got out of that environment when she wrote to Clara Laughlin, who was a columnist for the Ladies' Home Journal, and she wrote, "How can a perfectly nice but revolting young girl strike out on her own?" Yeah. And Laughlin was impressed enough to invite her to Chicago in 1908, when Anderson would have been about 21, 22. So she started writing book reviews and interviewing stage actors. She loved Chicago from the very beginning. There was one hiccup in her early life here, which was her family only agreed to let her come if she brought her sister Lois with her. And so Margaret and Lois, they started living in Chicago. They were still getting a small allowance from their parents, and between the allowance and her, small pittance of money from book reviews and credit, They started buying a lot of things like fancy rugs and cigarettes for their friends, and Anderson would always buy yellow roses, so they were just spending lots of money. And Clara Laughlin, this mentor of Anderson's, actually told their parents on them, so they had to go back to Indianapolis. But by then, Anderson had had a taste of freedom and resolved to get back to Chicago as soon as she could. So she did. You can see there's a picture from a Washington Post article about Anderson. She's only 24, but she smokes and wears trousers as society rebel about her at around this time. And so Anderson pretty quickly became part of the literary scene in Chicago. She worked for a while at the Fine Arts Building on 410 South Michigan. She worked first in Brown's Bookstore, which was a bookstore designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. It didn't last for that long, I believe, as a bookstore. It was on the 7th floor, so maybe not too much traffic there. But she also, she started working for publications. She worked for the Chicago Evening Post with Floyd Dell, which is a name that'll come up again. He was a big player in the literary scene at the time. She also worked for the Dial magazine, and that was a pretty interesting publication. It had originated in the 1840s with Ralph Waldo Emerson's circle, only lasted for a few years then, but was resurrected by Francis Brown in Chicago in 1880, and lasted here until about 1916, then had another incarnation in New York where it got kind of more experimental, and was the first place T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland was published, at least in the U.S. She ended up leaving the Dial after, she said in her memoir, the publisher, Francis Brown, tried to kiss her, and she was not interested. So, but she later kind of got back at the Dial by calling them a de-alcoholized little review. Not entirely sure what she meant by that, but it's a good line. She had also worked for a religious magazine or publication called The Continent, and she left that magazine in part because she said that readers were upset that she was not reviewing the moral content of the books and instead was just saying if they were good or not. She had reviewed the novel Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser, and some readers got upset that she didn't warn them that Carrie has affairs in the book. And, you know, how would they know not to give it to their daughters? So she began to have a circle of friends. They would get together for literary evenings. A lot of this revolved around Floyd Dell from the Chicago Evening Post. And so she was getting together with people like Sherwood Anderson and Carl Sandburg, Theodore Dreiser, who she wrote the review about. And these were writers who mostly had Midwestern roots, so just a lot of people coming together who were either from Chicago or from places like Indiana, like Anderson, or Dell was from Iowa. So just getting people together, and this started to give her the idea of starting her own magazine. And she really wanted to capture the spirit of these evenings of conversation and just filling this magazine with the best conversation that the world had to offer, she would say. The magazine was named after the Little Theater, which was also in the Fine Arts Building. So this was just like a teeny tiny little theater. I think it had 91 seats, something like that. So like her magazine, it was aimed at a small crowd, but wanted to try some ambitious and experimental things. So she wanted to capture that spirit. And so this is the time she starts planning the magazine is around 1913, 1914. So a pretty exciting time. A lot of things happening in the world, not just World War I happening in Europe, but also very early in what we now think of as the modernist movement in literature and art. There's a great Virginia Woolf line, in or around December 1910, human character changed. So people had this sense that things were changing and that there were new types of art, things like free verse poetry, stream of consciousness in literature, all of the different art movements of the time to sort of capture this idea that the world was becoming more modern and things were changing. And I didn't mention, but also on the handout is 837 West Ainsley. That is where Anderson lived early in her time in Chicago. And for a while, the Little Review was in the Fine Arts Building for a while, also for a while at her home at 837 West Ainsley. And if you go there now, you can see like a sign out front marking it as her former residence. And then just sort of moving forward, 1913 was the year of the Armory Show in Chicago. Oh, everything okay?
Oh, you're good. You're good. Don't mind me. Ignore the woman behind the curtain.
So the Armory Show had started in New York and then came to Chicago and one other city. I can't think of it offhand. It might have been Boston. But this was a show that became known as the Armory Show because it was first displayed in an armory. Museums in New York didn't really want to have this show because of the nature of some of the art that was featured. And this was, I mean, there were a lot of different artists there, but it was the first taste of movements like Cubism and Fauvism for people in the U.S. for the most part. It was a first look at some of this art from Europe. And if you take a look at the handout, you can see both one of the more famous artworks from the show, Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, which, was pretty startling for a lot of people. Some people were very excited by this new style, by the way he explored movement and the human body in this unexpected way. But also there was a lot of mockery. One critic referred to it as an explosion at a shingles factory. And then there's, of course, that great article, Cubists Depart, Students Joyful, which was what happened when students at the School of the Art Institute, I mean, a lot of them really were not impressed by this exhibition. They actually, some of these students burned copies of artworks, and they had this show trial that was meant to be of Henri Matisse, or as they called him, Henry Hair Mattress. They found him guilty of artistic murder, pictorial arson,
Oh my gosh.
artistic rapine, total degeneracy of color, criminal misuse of line, general aesthetic aberration. So, I mean, there was a lot going on in art and literature that some people were very excited about and some people were very much not excited about. There were 100,000 people in Chicago who saw the exhibit, which was more than anywhere else in the U.S. So this was the context where Anderson started this magazine, and there was little doubt what side she was on in this issue. This was also shortly after Poetry magazine was started in Chicago. That started in 1912. Many of the same writers wrote for both magazines, although there were some significant differences as well. The Little Review was generally thought of as sort of or it presented itself as a younger publication. Harriet Monroe, who edited Poetry magazine, was in her 40s when she started that. Anderson was only in her 20s. And there was also just generally probably more of an insurrectionist spirit in the Little Review, since they talked about a lot of political issues as well as the poetry. It's also a time when you started to see a lot of editors and publishers of modernist or experimental literature who were women. And, you know, you can look not only at Anderson and Harriet Monroe, also people like Harriet Shaw Weaver, who published The Egoist in the UK. Virginia Woolf would start up the Hogarth Press with her husband Leonard. And so this was another change. If you looked at some of the larger magazines or book publishers, there were sometimes limits to what women were able to do at those places. But with some of these smaller publications, more experimental publications, you did start to see more women getting involved. There's a pamphlet out there from 1916, I saw this in an article, that actually warned women about the difficulties of working in newspapers or for some magazines, saying, quote, "The editors, the publishers, and the men who rewrite stories must be able to work under the pressure in a way that is beyond the power of most women." So, yeah.
Really?
But, you know, Anderson was part of this change at the time. The first issue of the Little Review came out in 1914 in March. Anderson wrote essays in it, and there were other essays as well to talk about the goals of the magazine. Anderson said her goal was to enjoy the untrammeled liberty, which is the life of art. So that was her main principle. And the Little Review, it attracted a lot of support, also a lot of criticism, and it really became a Chicago institution. They wanted to be a global voice and to feature global literature, but there were a significant number of contributors from Chicago. Over 20% of the contributors were from Chicago, and I think over 30% of the total content was from Chicago writers. So it was both local and global. They wanted to bring in local writers and people from all over. And as she kind of grew comfortable at the Little Review, Anderson didn't waste much time setting a high standard for the work at the magazine. If you take a look at the blank issue from September 1916, she published an issue that was mostly blank pages, just saying that the submissions were not, not up to par, not good enough for the magazine, and they couldn't run anything. She wrote, "The Little Review hopes to be a magazine of art. The September issue is offered as a want ad." So, I mean, people were impressed by this. Ezra Pound, who became a pretty important figure at the magazine, that was what convinced him that this was a magazine to watch and that he wanted to be a part of it. There was also a Vers Libre, a free verse contest in 1917, and Anderson criticized a lot of the contributions, the submissions, and she wrote, "I know very little about poetry contests, but I imagine there has never been one in the history of poetry which could boast so many really bad poems."
Oh.
Yeah, she was very forthright. And I mean, she would really go to bat for writers she enjoyed, work that she enjoyed, and the magazine was really a labor of love. They constantly struggled for money, and Anderson was pretty tireless in trying to attract advertising, but they did struggle a lot. They moved headquarters a few times, from the Fine Arts Building to her home at 834 West Ainslie. And even for a 6-month stint, she and some of her colleagues worked and lived in a group of tents on Lake Michigan, around Lake Bluff. I think it was partly a stunt, maybe half a stunt, but also they didn't have any money and they were just trying to make do with what they had. And they remained defiant and discriminatory. The cover soon had the motto, "Making no compromise with the public taste." And the inside motto was, "The magazine read by those that write the others." If you take a look, there's a few letters to the magazine. These are really interesting to read. Anderson got a lot of fans, but also many detractors as well, and people weren't shy about sharing their views about the writers in the magazine and the submissions. There was one rave that compared the magazine to a delightful youth, gifted, daring, insolent, and swashbuckling. But others criticized the magazine equally emphatically, one saying, "The Little Review sickens me. I don't know why in the devil you talk imagism and color and beauty and fill your magazine with that sputtering trash." There were a number of pretty famous fans of the magazine as well. Frank Lloyd Wright, one of his letters is there. He wrote a letter sympathizing with their money troubles and saying, "I wish I had $1 million or a pen." So it's nice of him. He did give them $100, which at the time I'm sure would have been a lot of money.
He had like 9 kids.
Oh, did he?
He also had very little money.
Yeah.
Oh.
Maybe he should have kept that for his children. He abandoned. He's spending his money.
He was. Still in my nice home.
I like how we're all just shit talking Frank Lloyd Wright.
Why not?
What's he gonna do about it?
Well, in addition to Frank Lloyd Wright, several other well-known people became associated with the magazine. You can see some of them here. Anderson's memoirs are really fun to read because she does talk about a lot of these people. I'll give you just a few samples of some things she said about them. She said of Hemingway that he was, quote, so soft-hearted that it must be all that he can bear to beat a punching bag. She said that Carl Sandburg lived a domestic suburban life, but tramped the Chicago streets composing his working man saga. She also described Amy Lowell, the Imagist poet, who seems like she would have been a blast to hang around. She described Lowell as a very large but very charming woman who just loved to smoke cigars. One of the first times she met Lowell, Lowell went up to her and said, "Have a cigarette, I smoke cigars." So she had an opportunity to have Lowell finance the magazine, but she declined, even though they were always short on money, because she didn't want to give up the control. She thought that Lowell would probably want creative control. There was also Ezra Pound, who became the foreign editor of the magazine, and Anderson really trusted his judgment a lot, but she didn't like his habit of kissing women on the forehead and tried to talk him out of doing that. According to her memoirs, I mean, maybe some of this should be taken with a grain of salt, but yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff in there. Anderson said that almost everything the Little Review published in the early years was material that wouldn't have been accepted by other magazines. So in her view, at least, she was giving these writers a place to publish their work, and many of them did become very important. But her most important relationship through the Little Review was with Jane Heap, who eventually became her co-editor and for a while her romantic partner as well. Heap didn't really want to advertise her contributions to the magazine. She didn't have her name on much for a long time, and after a while she would put her initials JH in lowercase. But she seemingly didn't want the spotlight. She was an art teacher from Topeka, Kansas initially, and had been involved in the Little Theater, but she cut a striking figure. Anderson was very impressed by her, often wore a suit and tie and had short hair. She and her friends, when she was growing up, I think, would call each other names like Richard and James. So she was kind of, willing to seem a bit out of the ordinary, and Anderson was really impressed by that. So together with these writers and artists and thinkers, Anderson started to explore different social and political issues in addition to introducing this experimental writing in the magazine. In the first issue, in fact, she wrote, "Feminism, a clear-thinking magazine, can have only one attitude. The degree of ours is ardent." So, other issues expressed support for gay rights, which was very rare at the time. Some say it might have been one of the first editorials, at least written by a woman, to support gay rights. There's something on the handout, a little article and an ad for Margaret Sanger, who came to Chicago to talk about birth control. And also, for a while, Anderson supported Emma Goldman and both Goldman's ideas about birth control and also some of her anarchist ideas as well. They did have a falling out, sort of later on, when Anderson said that she was really more interested in revolutionary art rather than revolutionary politics. But she did consider Emma Goldman a friend. She would call her E.G., since she didn't want the informality of calling her Emma because she respected her a lot, and Goldman didn't want formality, so that was kind of a compromise. But Anderson faced some risks for expressing these views. At one point, her landlord visited her and warned her not to have Goldman in the apartment again. They also sometimes had trouble attracting advertising because of the association with these more radical ideas. And you can see Anderson's response to that in this bit on the handout, where there's a couple of squares and she says how difficult it is to get advertisements for an artistic magazine. And so she offers up space that could have been used by advertisers. But she writes things instead. There's one for Carson Peary Scott, where she says, "The man I interviewed made such a face when I told him we were radical that I haven't had the courage to go back and pester him for the desired full page." There were also some similar fake ads for Marshall Fields and a few other places in Chicago and other places in the U.S.
It gets wilder.
Yeah. But beyond the advertising, beyond the threat of landlords being upset about your guests, there was the threat of government suppression as well. And there were two main areas where the Little Review faced risks for that. And one was risks involved with talking about things like birth control, including sexually explicit content and things like that. There was legislation such as the Comstock Law from 1873, which made it illegal to send obscene materials in the mail. This included not only birth control, but also information about birth control. So this is something that, had gotten people like Sanger and Goldman in trouble in the past. And there were 500 cases related to this law prosecuted in Chicago since its passage. The justification for this kind of censorship was often seen as the need to protect young people, and especially young women and girls, from these corrupting influences.
Oh.
Yeah. There's a good quote from Jane Heap about all this. She talks about the Society for the Suppression of Vice, and says, "This society, I am told, was founded to protect the public from corruption. When asked what public, its defenders spring to the rock on which America was founded, the cream puff of sentimentality, and answer chivalrously, our young girls. So the mind of the young girl rules this country. In it rests the safety, progress, and luster of a nation." So that was one concern in terms of the threat of censorship. Another major piece of legislation or area where they could risk censorship was involved World War I and the Espionage Act of 1917. And this banned or at least the amendments to the law, banned mailing or distributing materials that were seen as injuring the war effort or obstructing the draft. And even things that were seen as being insulting to America's allies could come under this legislation. You might know the case of Schenck versus the United States, where Charles Schenck was charged with violating this act for distributing a pamphlet opposing the draft. If you know the phrase shouting fire in a crowded theater, that is the case it comes from. But also Floyd Dell, Anderson's former colleague at the Chicago Evening Post, was involved in a case where he and some other writers at a later publication he worked on, The Masses in New York, they went on trial for violating the Espionage Act. And The Masses was called treasonable material. They went on trial to see if they would be jailed or fined, and eventually got 2 mistrials. But there was an interesting and kind of scary thing that happened in the first case, where it was mostly due to one holdout on the jury that the mistrial was declared, because one person on the jury was a socialist, like the people who made the magazine, and according to some sources, the other jurors actually tried to have this juror arrested, and some wanted to physically attack him, but they did eventually get that mistrial. And so Anderson was well aware of all this. You can see this article she ran in the little review called The War, that's just a blank page with a little note at the bottom, "We will probably be suppressed for this." So she was commenting on that. There's also the comic there from Puck magazine. This comments on the Comstock law, and a woman says, "Oh dear me, what shall I do? My shoestring has come untied, and there's that dreadful Anthony Comstock just behind me." He's going to get after her for indecency because her shoe's untied.
Oh.
So, again, the Anderson and the others who worked on the little review, they were very, very conscious of the risks they were running and the idea that their magazine could be suppressed, and it wasn't that long before they were. The first time was in October 1917. They printed a story by Wyndham Lewis called Cantleman's Springmate. This was a story about a disillusioned soldier who has an affair with a farmer's daughter, and eventually she becomes pregnant and he goes off to the front. She sends him letters that become desperate, and he reads them all, but he doesn't respond. So the Postal Service refused to deliver this. Anderson didn't know what was happening at first, but people just weren't getting their magazines. And when she got an explanation, they said that it was obscene, lewd, or lascivious. It's actually a little unclear why exactly it was seen as undeliverable. Despite this official reason, some people think it was actually because the story had these sort of cynical views about the war, and that was the true reason that it wasn't delivered. You can see her reaction to that. She vowed to fight the decision. legally and to try to get it reversed, but she wasn't successful. A district court upheld the decision.
What?
So around this time, the Little Review moved out of Chicago to New York initially. It later moved to Paris. Anderson spoke of this as kind of making the magazine truly a global publication. But she did miss Chicago a lot, and Jane Heap did as well. They continued to have a lot of ties to Chicago. And shortly after that, in 1918, they started running Ulysses. And this was something that they did with great fanfare. A lot of people were very excited about Joyce's Ulysses and the magazine's plan of serializing the novel. They ran ads, just kind of trumpeting Ulysses as the prose masterpiece of our generation, something like that. And but they knew they were facing risks at the same time. Ezra Pound, by then he was the foreign editor, wrote a letter saying, Joyce's new novel has a corking first chapter, which will get us suppressed. And I mean, you know, Joyce set out to create this, what he considered a celebration of the commonplace, but he really wanted to include all of the commonplace, even if it was seen as blasphemous or explicit or involving political subversion or things like that. So the first few chapters were printed in the magazine. The first few went by without incident. Some readers were delighted, and others wrote those angry letters to the magazine, calling it the most damnable slush and filth that has ever polluted paper in print. And soon after that, the Postal Service started to agree. They started confiscating and destroying some of the issues. It's unclear exactly what they did with them. Anderson and Joyce both refer to the issues being burned. I haven't been able to confirm that. Not every source says that. There's actually one source that refers to a rumor that they were sent these like magazines that had to be suppressed and other materials to the Salvation Army, and the people who were, you know, staying at the Salvation Army and being helped by them had the job of tearing them up, which I think is probably not true, but is an interesting rumor, at least. So the first suppression most likely happened for a scene where Leopold Bloom, one of the main characters in Ulysses, is in a diner, in an eating establishment, and he watches two flies that are stuck together. They're mating, and he thinks about this early experience with his wife where they're on a hill. And I mean, you can take a look. It's maybe a little steamy for 1919. Yeah.
It's a little gross.
yeah, it is a little, yeah.
Mawkish pulp in her mouth?
Yes. Yes. Here, have some snack.
I went to Catholic
Old timey smut.
Yeah.
I got lots of fat nipples.
Oh my god.
Very much.
So, yeah, Anderson didn't want to censor anything, but eventually she was faced with the possibility that she wouldn't be able to keep the magazine going, so reluctantly she started making cuts to Ulysses, possibly to some other things as well. And she made clear that she was not happy about this. She at one point wrote, "To avoid a similar interference this month, I have ruined Mr. Joyce's story by cutting certain passages in which he mentions natural facts known to everyone." And Ezra Pound also made some cuts. Joyce appreciated these efforts on his behalf, although he was pretty strongly opposed to these changes to his work. There's one scene where Leopold Bloom goes to the outhouse and Ezra Pound cut a lot of it, and Joyce not only restored all the cut material when he, made Ulysses into a book, but he actually expanded on this scene. So, but I mean, even with these cuts, the Postal Service kept saying that they couldn't deliver issues and continued to confiscate and suppress these issues. In some cases, it's unclear exactly why they did that. In several cases, it could have been for sexual content, but in some cases, it could have been for political reasons as well. Even things like having characters say bad things about the British monarchy was what Jane Heap was convinced led to one of these refusals to deliver the magazine. But then the biggest act of suppression came in 1920, and this was not from the USPS, but was from the Society for the Suppression of Vice. And the episode, the chapter in question, was from the Nausicaa episode of Ulysses, in which a young woman is on the beach with some friends. At a certain point, she's on her own, and she's looking at a man, who's Leopold Bloom, this character, who's further down the beach. She's interested. She thinks he's kind of mysterious and aloof. And she sort of leans back and shows her garters and then her underwear. And so he becomes aroused, and there is this scene with lots and lots of innuendo where there's fireworks going off while she is showing her garters and all that. And, there are fireworks bursting, and people are oohing and eyeing, and it is all very, very obvious. So maybe not a huge surprise that this got them into some trouble. But it was delivered to people's homes, and Anderson had actually sent out some copies of this issue unsolicited because she wanted to drum up some more subscribers. So it landed with a lawyer's daughter. The lawyer was not pleased at what his daughter was reading. And, again, with censorship and wanting to protect young girls, this was an episode that was about a girl, a young woman being sexualized or corrupted, as some people might say, and it had gotten into the hands of a young woman as well. So authorities arranged to buy an issue of this magazine from a local bookshop, and they initially arrested the bookseller, but then made arrangements to exchange the bookseller for Anderson and Heap instead. So they went on trial for this, for obscenity, and they were not sorry about it. Anderson saw the secretary of the Society for the Suppression of Vice at the police station. She said that she gloried in publishing this issue and that she would do it again. And so, she was defiant and she went on trial. And the trial didn't really go well. Her lawyer, a man named John Quinn, who did like the little review, but thought that they were pretty reckless in some of what they printed, he kind of didn't defend them as well as he could have. There are differing accounts of how much he could have done, but he did have witnesses to defend the artistic merit of the issue and of Ulysses, and he argued that the episodes wouldn't corrupt anyone, but he also didn't himself believe that they should have been publishing this uncut. There were a couple of comical moments during the trial. At one point, the prosecuting attorney wanted to read the offending passages aloud, and one of the judges objected to doing it because Anderson was a lady and you couldn't read this in front of a lady. The attorney said, "But she's the publisher." And the judge said, "I'm sure she didn't really know the significance of what she was publishing."
Wow.
Yeah.
Doubly insulting.
Mm-hmm. So Anderson and Heap were both found guilty. They had to pay $50 apiece. If you look at some of the press about the decision, it's so vague as to be meaningless because the newspapers had to worry about what they printed as well. There's a New York Times article, "Improper novel costs women $100. And then there's that subheading, "Woman's dress described," which, I guess was as much as they could really say without getting into trouble. And after the trial, the lawyer, John Quinn, said to Anderson, "And now, for God's sake, don't publish any more obscene literature." Anderson said, "How am I to know when it's obscene?" Quinn said, "I'm sure I don't know, but don't do it." So she did pay the money, so did Jane Heap. Anderson regretted doing that. She later said she wished she would have refused to pay and seen if they would jail her, and this could perhaps bring people's attention to the injustice of these laws and also possibly drum up support for the magazine as well. But she didn't. She did pay the money. The magazine was ordered to stop printing any more parts of Ulysses, and for a while, for quite a while actually, no U.S. publisher would touch it. It was banned in the U.S. and many other English-speaking countries until in the U.S. there was a case in 1933 called "The United States of America versus one book entitled Ulysses," and eventually the ban came down. Here's a quote from Heap about this judgment. She said, "Mr. Joyce was not teaching early Egyptian perversions nor inventing new ones. Girls lean back everywhere, showing lace and silk stockings, wear low-cut sleeveless blouses, breathless bathing suits. Men think thoughts and have emotions about these things everywhere, seldom as delicately and imaginatively as Mr. Bloom, and no one is corrupted." So after that, eventually Anderson started to step back from the little review. She from about 1924 to 1929, when the magazine stopped publishing, it was mostly done by Jane Heap, and she kind of shifted the focus a little bit. Since Heap was an artist, she focused a bit more on art. You can see the advertisement that came out after the trial. The little review is immortal. Surpasses all, includes all, outlives all isms. You can see some of those movements in art and literature. I mean, this was meant to be defiant, although the magazine was hurt by the trial and by the issues that they couldn't get delivered. Eventually, the publishing slowed down. There weren't many issues at all in 1921, and it went to a quarterly publication for a while instead of a monthly one. Anderson moved to Paris. She, after her relationship with Jane Heap, she met and fell in love with Georgette Leblanc, who was a French singer. She also wrote several memoirs, and both she and Heap started following the philosopher, mystic George Gurdjieff, I think. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but that was part of her later life. And also after Georgette Leblanc died, Anderson met and had a relationship with Dorothy Caruso, who was Enrico Caruso, the singer's wife, his widow. So she had a lot of interesting relationships with people. She lived in France for quite a while, and in her later years, she worked a lot on something she called her collection, which was just a bunch of letters and writings she had from people she'd been in contact with. She did try to curate them and write introductions to them. So she really did, through her life, try to bring people together and try to bring writing together. She just had a lot of enthusiasm for art and literature and wanted to introduce it to other people. And the little review ended in 1929, and by that point, Margaret Anderson had mostly stepped back from the magazine, but she did get involved in the last issue, and she had that neat questionnaire, which is...
Print on everyone's
Okay.
You can QR code it though. Thank you.
This was a project she got excited about. She sent this questionnaire to all sorts of people she knew from the arts and from the literary world and all that. And she just wanted to know these things about what you would most like to do, to know, to be. Some of them are pretty interesting. What is your worldview? Are you a reasonable being in a reasonable scheme?
Why do you go on living?
Yeah. But she sent this to people including William Carlos Williams and Sherwood Anderson, James Joyce, who said he had nothing to say. He couldn't think of any answers. Sent it to Einstein, who was too ill by that point to finish it. Havelock Ellis, the sexologist, said that he would respond, but he would just fill volumes with his answers, so he didn't end up doing it. But they did get a lot of responses. So I thought I would end with that questionnaire and just the idea that she had this great curiosity about people and about life and just wanted to bring these ideas about life and art to readers and share them with everyone. Yeah.
did they have like a certain department in the post office that was like reading everything, or and does it still exist?
Repeat the question.
So the question was how this worked with the post office and whether they had like a specific department looking at these magazines and this mail to monitor it, right? And does it still exist now? So I'm not 100% sure exactly how this operated. The Postal Service did work in concert with the Society for the Suppression of Vice, and with
Such a funny name.
yeah, and a lot of this did come out of the Comstock law because Anthony Comstock was a postal inspector. So from what I understand, this came about through the Office of the Postal Inspector. So that office would have been involved in monitoring mail, monitoring magazines, and that sort of thing. And this probably was stepped up during wartime with things like the Espionage Act and, more concern with monitoring not only any sensitive information going through the mail, but also things that were seen as injuring morale. I don't think that it operates the same way nowadays, since most of these laws, I mean, they've either been struck down or at least parts of them have been struck down. There's parts of that question I'm not totally 100% on, but that would be really interesting to look into exactly how that worked. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah.
First, I love that Carl Sandburg shade. That was amazing. I'm going to use that for all transplants. I know they come to the city now. And second, do you know if the Little Theater in the Fine Arts Building was the same as the Studebaker Theater in the Fine Arts Building? Or, because that place has more nooks and crannies than English Muffin. So I'm I don't know if there was another theater in there. Or if that was the one they were, because I've never been to the Studebaker Theater before, so I'm I'm not sure if that was the one.
Well, that is the same building, right? The
Yeah.
Studebaker and the Fine. Yeah. I don't think the Little Theater lasted for very long, but it might have been in the same space.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure on that. Yes.
So negative space in literature, she seems to be a pioneer of using the blank page. Were there others during her time who used negative space in that same way?
Repeat the question.
So the question was about the use of blank space, and you were saying that Anderson used blank space in a really interesting way in a lot of her work. I'm sure you're probably talking about the blank issue and also the war article with just the little note at the bottom. Yeah, there were other people using negative space in similar ways. Starting at around that time, you did start to get things like poetry that was meant to sort of be in the shape of something that was important to the meaning of the poem. So the words would be, arranged in a way that would use space but also text to sort of create a picture. I think also you can kind of tie that in as well to just the idea of minimalism in a lot of art at that time. The Little Review printed a lot of Imagist poets, and a lot of the Imagist poets' work was focused on, just looking at one image or one image juxtaposed with another image, and, just very short and to the point, and kind of using economy of text. And I think that kind of relates to Anderson's use of space as well.
Questions? Seeing a lot of hands up.
I have a question about her bravery.
Yeah.
So was at any point, was she at any point afraid of what she was doing and the sort of the buttons that she was pushing, and experiencing blowback from that? I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think she was. I think she often chose to press on in any case. And she wrote a memoir, she wrote several, but her first was called My 30 Years War, and it's just about how her, like, natural tendency is just to fight against everyone and everything. But I think you see with her making those cuts to Ulysses, for example, she was afraid that she wasn't going to be able to get her magazine delivered, that it might even have to stop publication because of that. So I think she definitely was aware of the risks and was afraid of them to some extent at least. But in a lot of cases, she would just press on. Yes.
Did the Litter Review ever publish any works by people of color?
Repeat the question.
So the question was, did the Little Review ever publish any work by people of color? And not many. I'm trying to think of any examples. They did mostly publish white writers, and even though they wanted to show like this kind of global literature, a lot of their literature from abroad was from Europe, and same for art. So I'm trying to think of examples, but even in some of the sort of more international stuff that they tried to run, it would be things like poems in a Japanese style, but by a white writer. So they did have some blind spots there, definitely. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So most figures in the 1910s and 20s who were queer, a lot of times we're guessing or inferring that they were gay or queer or just not super basic and straight. So why do you think it is that there is so much awareness for Margaret Anderson being a queer woman, and how much of it was public knowledge at the time or semi-public knowledge versus how much of it did we learn after the fact?
That's a really good question, and I think, it was semi-public knowledge at the time. I think there definitely was a difference between how people reacted to her and how people reacted to Jane Heap, who was seen as like more masculine, wearing the short hair and wearing ties and that sort of thing. There were a number of people who seemed to be unaware, even among her close associates at the time. I mentioned some quotations from Ben Hecht, and another one, at some point he said something like, "I forgave her chastity because she was a genius." and he was kind of like in love with her a little bit. But yeah, thinking of it as her chastity is, yeah. So I think with her, with some of the other people in her circle, it was known among her circle. And there were a number of other queer people in her circle, like I believe Floyd Dell was also is pretty well known now that he was also queer. And then Heap and, her later relationships with LeBlanc and Dorothy Caruso, which is just really neat.
Do we mostly know of it because of her memoirs, do you think?
I think that's probably a pretty good factor in there. Another interesting thing, which is not totally related, but just sort of neat, is that even though she and Jane Heap drifted apart a bit, Heap ended up adopting her nephews. Yeah, her sister Lois, the one whom she initially came to Chicago with, had some mental health problems and couldn't really take care of her kids for a while. And Anderson was not at all interested in raising kids, but Jane Heap adopted them and raised them for a while.
I was wondering, have you been to the Lake Bluff Beach?
No. So you're referring to when they stayed in tents?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned 6 months, and there's a few different reports about how long they were there. And like you say, it seems like a crafted kind of narrative.
Yeah.
But this time when she was on the beach, Margaret Anderson was an unapologetic snob.
Yeah.
And even when she was living on the beach, supposedly homeless, she had set up these tents, and she had this priceless art hung in the tents. She had Persian rugs in the tents, and Floyd Dell, Ben Heck, Sherwood Anderson, all, by the way, who were in love with her.
Yeah.
They've all written about being in love with her. They would come by, and they had this, it was a spectacle, right? Margaret, my wife here, and my son Dusty and I, last summer, we drove out there. There's not many beaches out there to try to pinpoint where this was. There's not a big beach in Lake Bluff, so I think this was it, but I just was wondering if anybody could document where it actually was, because there's no markers or signs or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't really able to see much like actual documentation about this. I mean, there's a number of references to it, but
It was
yeah,
written about
not.
during that time. But it's just always a beach in Lake Bluff.
Yeah.
It's still there, because like the climate change has been raising lake levels, like in Highland Park. They're losing their lakefront, so like beaches that were there like 5 years ago, now they're like up to your ankles now in water.
Right, and that's what I was wondering.
That's how I was wondering, like,
we're
is it
there, I'm
still
wondering
there?
if this is the same.
Or it's just like, oh yeah, it's 2 feet underwater now.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that Lake Bluff Beach is the same beach as
Yeah, I'm like, I'm wondering, I was
100 years
curious
ago, I
about
don't
that
know.
too.
Yeah.
I'm like, is it under like 2 feet of water now? Like the Rogers Park beaches?
Interesting. All right, last questions, anyone? Okay, we got 2, 3? 3. We have 3.
Last 3 questions.
Last 3 questions.
Where are the results of this questionnaire? I find it uniquely fascinating.
Oh, yeah. So the results of the questionnaire, you would need, I mean, you can find some of them online. With looking for issues of the Little Review, it's very easy to find them up to 1922. I mean, I would assume this has to do with those issues being in the public domain and some issues not being in the public domain yet. With the later issues, you pretty much have to go to, a library to see all of them. You can find some results of the questionnaire just by searching online. Some of them are available. For example, I know just like doing an internet search, you can find some for writers like Mina Loy. I think you can also find the William Carlos Williams one, just based on people being interested in those writers. But to hunt down the actual issue, I do think you need to, actually go to a university library for that. By the way, there's a great resource, Modernist Journals, that has all of the little review issues up to 1922, also has issues of lots of other publications from the early 1900s through the 1920s. So it's a great resource to check out.
And the Fine Arts Building, is there any plaque where her office was in the building?
No, that I'm not sure. There definitely is. There is a sign outside of that Ainsley building where she lived.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think there is in the Fine Arts Building.
Like I wandered around there on a rainy day one day, and I'm like, Frank Lloyd Wright was in there, everyone. Like,
By the way, you know, Francis Brown, who you mentioned, same Brown as the bookstore. Back then, a lot of bookstores were also publishers, and they ran magazines and so forth. And I was wondering, you know, because later Fanny Butcher, was her bookstore in the Fine Arts Building? Was it the Brown bookstore? Do you know?
I don't know that, no.
So I was just wondering, based on your research or in her memoirs, does she give a lot more detail on places that she would have hung around with her crowd in Chicago? And if so, do those places still exist? Where were they? I'm curious.
Can you go there?
Yeah, we got there.
Not a lot, unfortunately. Her first memoir is mostly the one where she talks about being in Chicago. So she does talk a lot about the Fine Arts Building in that one. She talks about Lake Bluff as well. But she also wrote memoirs during a lot of her time in Paris. So if you read like the first half or the first 3/4 of her first memoir, which is My 30 Years War, there is some stuff about places in Chicago. Maybe not as much as I would like, but there's some talk about her Ainsley Building, the Fine Arts Building, some of the parties with Floyd Dell's group that she went to.
Do you know anything about what was the women's like housing for artists, for women artists in Restoration Hardware?
The Three Arts Club?
The Three Arts Club, yeah. Do you know if there's any mention of that, or like would that been her era?
For students.
Oh, for students.
Students,
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, guys, give it up for Emily.
Thanks so much.
There's ways to donate on your way out if you haven't yet, and come back next week, guys. That's it.
What's next week?
Next week is the women who built Chicago. We'll be talking about developers, builders, architects, and other ladies as such.
Oh, thank you. I can.
Oh, I got it.
Maybe all be a
Good
little
job,
bit
honey.
more like
Oh, thanks.
Margaret Anderson.
Great job. Yeah.